Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. My name is Gerald Frost. I'm the director of the Danube Institute, and to those not familiar with its work, I should explain that its purpose is to provide an independent forum for debate on political, economic, social and cultural issues. We make no secret of our own political colours. Atlanticist in foreign policy and classical liberal in economics, we nevertheless seek to engage with centre-right parties and their democratic opponents to discuss matters of mutual interest. Our experience to date inclines us to the view that there is too little intellectual exchange in Central Europe, and this is certainly true, we think, of Hungary. Political adversaries, whether in the universities or in mainstream politics, may say unpleasant things about one another, sometimes very unpleasant things about one another, but they seldom engage. One way of trying to encourage greater engagement is by organising debates such as the one we are about to witness, in which opposing views can be analysed, criticised, discussed, debated, in an environment which permits robust exchange, but in a civilised and organised way. This is the first debate that the Danube Institute has organised, but there will be several more during the course of the year. The subject of this evening's debate, as you will know from your invitation, is the impact and objectives of Mr. Putin's policies in the Ukraine. My task is to simply welcome you and to introduce our chairman, who will in turn introduce our speakers, ensure both sides of the argument get a fair hearing, explain the rules of engagement, and allow as many short interventions, and I stress the word short, as time permits. Our chairman needs very little by way of introduction because he is Professor János Mártonyi, the former Hungarian foreign minister from 1998 to 2002 and from 2010 to 2014. He's also a distinguished academic. He's Professor of International Trade Law and European Law at Szeged. I apologize for having pronounced the word wrongly. He is also managing partner of Baker and McKenzie in Budapest, which he has done for 10 years. Since standing down from office, he has continued to play an important but influential role in the public life of Hungary, and we are extremely grateful to him for having reorganized his schedule to come along this evening and share this debate. János.
Thank you, Gerald, for your very kind words. Welcome, everybody. I'll have to be very brief because we have a very strict schedule. I don't think I have to underline the importance of this topic and the discussion which you are going to have without myself, because I have to be strictly neutral and even-handed, so you will be unable to find out my own views. But of course, at the same time, we'll have an extremely interesting debate about all the arguments, all the issues relating to this topic, which is, as said, complex. It's a multifaceted, multi-dimensional topic. You have geoeconomics, you have geopolitics, maybe you also have some questions of principles and values. In any case, you have competing and conflicting arguments and considerations. So hopefully after the discussion, we'll understand better the topic, and we will be more able to understand the background and all the relevant factors. Now, it is also, as we all know, an emotionally laden topic. We have to be careful. Again, as I said, I'll have to be completely neutral. I will be. And at the end, of course, at the end of the discussion, you will be able to express your views by raising your hands when I ask the question who is for and who is against the motion. The question is very simple. You all read it. Do Putin's policies threaten European stability or not, depending upon? Now, we have four distinguished speakers, two on both sides. We have Charles Crawford, who is a former British diplomat, vice president of the Conservative Friends of Poland, and a founding member of a panel of former British ambassadors offering corporate diplomacy services. Educated at St. John's College in Oxford and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, he joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1979, remaining in the diplomatic service for almost 3 decades. He was UK ambassador to Sarajevo, Belgrade, and most recently to Poland. Charles has written a lot of articles on diplomacy and international politics for a number of well-known newspapers. Now we also have James Sherr. He just told me that he would prefer another Hungarian version of his name. Maybe an excellent red wine would be better than just to be called beer. But he's an associate fellow and a former head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, and was a member of the social studies faculty at Oxford University until 2012. He is also a visiting fellow of the Razumkov Center, Kyiv, and a senior associate fellow of the Institute of Statecraft. He was a fellow of the Conflict Studies Research Center of the UK Defence Academy, also an advisor to the House of Commons Defence Committee, Director of Studies of the Royal United Services Institute. For 20 years, he has advised governments in the UK, NATO, and the EU about developments in Russia and Ukraine, and for a number of years worked closely with Ukraine on defense and security sector reform. He is the author of Hard Diplomacy and Soft Coercion, Russia's Influence Abroad, and Ukraine and Europe, Final Decision, and numerous other publications. Now, on the other side, which is on the left side, which of course doesn't involve any political bias, Mr. Vlad Sobell is a leading Russia and Eastern Europe analyst and commentator with more than 35 years' experience. He began his career at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Munich in the mid-80s as an analyst focused on the former Soviet bloc. From 1990 onwards, he worked for the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. Thereafter, he spent some 15 years working in the City of London as a senior economist and analyst for Russia and Eastern Europe. He obtained his PhD from the St. Antony's College, Oxford, for a dissertation on economic integration in the Soviet bloc. He also holds a master's degree from the University of Essex, UK, and a bachelor's degree in Russian studies from the University of Liverpool, UK. He was born in Prague, but left for the West in 1969, shortly after the Soviet invasion. He returned to live and work in Prague in early 2012. Now, Timothy Less, he is an expert on Eastern Europe with 20 years' experience working on the region. He is the director of Nova Europa, a consultancy which provides research and analysis of political and economic risk in Eastern Europe, in private and public sector clients. He is also a lecturer in East European politics at the University of Kent. Prior to this, Tim spent a decade working as an analyst, diplomat, and policymaker at the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, where, among other things, he ran the British Embassy Office in Banja Luka, Bosnia, and the EU Institutions Department, and led on a number of projects concerned with political risk. He's also a former analyst for the ratings agency Dun & Bradstreet, where he covered the former Soviet Union. Now, last point, a couple of technical details. Each of the speakers will have 15 minutes, which makes altogether 1 hour. I just respectfully invite each of them to respect this time limit. Then we will have a discussion on the floor for 45 minutes. I would respectfully ask all the participants in that discussion whether they ask questions or whether they want to make comments to be as brief as possible. In any case, not longer than 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'll be obliged to intervene. I only have a very old wristwatch. We have no special technical devices here, but I try to follow the time because we need the time also for the responses. There will be responses on the speaker's side. 3 minutes. Okay, it's a bargain. 3 minutes for each of them. And then of course, as I said, we will conclude. And that will be, of course, the final and most important or most interesting part of this tonight's session. There'll be a quote-unquote vote on the motion. There'll be no vote count, I'm afraid. But of course, we will all have an impression about the outcome of the debate. So we will have, I'm sure, a very lively and very interesting and in-depth discussion. Let's start it. I would then invite Charles Crawford to take the floor. Thank you.
Excellencies, colleagues, friends, Mr. Chairman, I think it's always a good idea to start an occasion like this by talking about something other than the subject. Hands up everyone here who knows someone who's been murdered or killed in a car crash. One or two. Not many people here know anyone who's been murdered or killed in a car crash. And that's not a surprise, because if you look at certainly the murder statistics for the planet, Hungary has got one of the best records in the world. Out of 220 countries, Hungary is 176th, according to Wikipedia. USA, which has a lot of murders, is 111th. UK is even better than both those countries, 190th. Russia is 66th, just about where Haiti and Angola are in the list of homicides. Now, I ask this because I was in South Africa as a diplomat, and it suddenly struck me I knew quite a few people who had been killed or murdered in car crashes. Before I went to South Africa, I knew no one who had been killed or murdered in a car crash. I left South Africa, this was 98 to 91. I knew 15 people who had been killed in car crashes or been murdered. What's going on in South Africa? You can argue about why it's happening. Clearly, something different is going on in South Africa to produce such a spike of the numbers. What about journalists being murdered? How many journalists have been murdered in Hungary since 1992? According to the internet, 0. How many in Poland? 0. How many in the USA? 4. China, 2. France, 8. France, 8. They were the people who were killed the other day, murdered in Paris by the Islamic fundamentalists. Ukraine, 6. So 1 or 2 here and there. Russia, 36. At least 36 people murdered in the course of doing journalistic work. Dozens of others have been killed or disappeared in mysterious circumstances. Something is going on there which is different. We've just seen Boris Nemtsov, of course, being killed too. One of the things that never really comes up in all these discussions, I think, about Russia and Europe is the war in Chechnya. In Chechnya, 2 wars in Chechnya we've had since the end of the Cold War, something like, no one knows for sure, 100,000, 120,000, 150,000 Europeans have been killed. Russians have been killed. The basic Moscow policy towards Chechnya is, you want to leave Russia? We insist you stay in Russia. If you don't like it, we'll kill you. That's basically the policy. And what's really depressing about this is that there are no official statistics, even of Russian soldiers who've been killed in these conflicts. And you've got Russian soldiers, volunteers, whatever you want to call them now in Ukraine. The Russian state won't reveal details of the people who are dying there. They won't even reveal details of their own troops who have died defending their own country. This is different. It's very, very cynical. And it's all about the attitude of the state to ordinary people. There's nothing else like it, I'd like to suggest to you, anywhere else in Europe. This attitude of sort of violent dismissal by a state of its own people. Now, where does that come from? What makes, it's clear that Russia in that sense is a bit different. Why is it different? And, you go to Anna Karenina, you go to the Russian novels, the Russian soul, the Russian greatness. And what always strikes me about Anna Karenina is not just the great story, it's just that there's those great bits in it, page after page after page after page, of people arguing about what you do with the peasants. Where do they fit in? The aristocracy baffled by this problem of the Russian masses. And there is this sense of Russian greatness, a sense that normal categories of behavior must not apply to us. And we saw that at the end of the Second World War. I was in Moscow in 1995 when you had the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. I wrote John Major's speech. He came out as Prime Minister, President Clinton was there, others were there. I wrote the speech. And I put in the speech, we find it hard, British people. We're proud of what we did in the Second World War. We find it hard to put our heads around what happened in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union lost almost as many people attacking Berlin in the last few days of the war as we lost in the whole of the Second World War. These are astonishing numbers, wave after wave after wave of young Russian men driven against the Germans' onslaught, turn around, they get shot by their own people. Amazing. The scale of it is amazing. So when the Cold War ended, the Russian leaders had a real problem. And it is a real problem. How do you deal with the past? How do you deal with the fact that millions of Russians were murdered by the Russian leadership? And Ukrainians and Hungarians, but above all Russians. How do you actually deal with that? And it's difficult. And I think there was some attempt in the early days to cast some light on these issues. There were NGOs set up, there were symbolic, actually not totally symbolic, compensation paid to Russian citizens who'd been victims of communist crimes. But there's so many victims, and there are so many crimes. And so, and they didn't want to move Lenin. This, for me, was one of the huge mistakes we made at the end of the Cold War, not to say, come on, please, Mr. Lenin, decent burial. This has to stop. He's a symbol of evil right in your own Red Square. He's a symbol of the fact that your leaders murder your own people. Do you accept that? And it seems that they do accept that. Katyn was acknowledged, even though the archives weren't fully opened. So what was our response to all this? I'd say it was open. I was there. I was writing the policy papers. I'd say it was open, it was positive, but it was also careful because we weren't quite sure how deep the transition was, what it represented, was it going to be sustained. There were major assistance programs, economic assistance programs, huge programs that are still continuing, helping Russia demolish its chemical weapons, its biological weapons, deal with nuclear issues in a framework of partnership. Some people say, oh yes, but look at the way the West imposed shock therapy on Russia. This is simply not true. The shock therapy imposed on Russia was communism. That shock therapy lasted for 70 years. And when Mr. Putin says the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the end of the Soviet Union, he's completely wrong, I put to you. The greatest tragedy was the setting up of the Soviet Union because it led to millions and millions and millions of Russians being killed by their own government. And the symbol of that, Lenin, is still there. Now, we worked closely in those early days with Russia in a sense of partnership. I remember we went along one day to the Foreign Ministry. We'd asked them for help in dealing with terrorism against the UK. They will have in the Soviet Russian archives papers going from here, files going right to the back of that room and well beyond about the IRA. They will have followed the machinations of the IRA with the Libyans, with Gaddafi, with all these terrorist groups. You know, they knew a lot about this. But they said they would share some archives with us. They gave us one little folder with about 5 papers in, but that was okay. It was a start. We saw that as something not totally negative. The Budapest Memorandum was signed. I needn't tell you about that because it was signed here. One of the things it said, the US, Russia, and UK promised that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or through the UN Charter. We don't need to, not believe our eyes, right? It's quite clear that heavy Russian weaponry controlled by Russian citizens is in Ukraine, killing Ukrainians now. And it's, to me, very sad, actually, to see Russian diplomats lying about this on television. I remember, you don't know what pressures they're under, folks. I remember just when I left Moscow, I had lunch with a Russian diplomat who'd been very friendly. And I saw him a couple of days later. He said, "Did you see in the restaurant those people at the next table?" I said, no, I didn't, of course, I'm naive. I said, well, who are they listening to? He said, both of us. Both of us. People are under pressure, so when you see people talking about these nonsensical stories, you do not know what pressures they are under to say this. The answer to the debate question is simple. Are these policies a threat to European stability? Yes. I mean, there's no great issue with that, I think. The question is, what are the rival arguments? And we're going to hear our distinguished colleagues give some rival arguments. One rival argument is that Ukraine isn't Europe anyway. The Soviet space, the former Soviet Union, is something different, something which isn't quite, it's not European, let's be honest. So therefore, different rules apply. It's not governed by international law. Look at Ukrainians. They're not even Europeans anyway. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. That's one general argument you see in the comments of British newspapers when all these trolls come in from the internet. The second argument might be, yes, it's a problem, but other problems are bigger. Look at the Eurozone. That's a much bigger threat to European security than anything else. And that might even be true. Radek Sikorski made a famous speech in Berlin about this, which if you look on the internet, you'll see I helped him with. He said, I fear German inactivity more than I'm starting to fear German tanks. I think that was something like the line. Yes, the Eurozone is a major problem, but it's no comfort to Russia if that is true. If the Eurozone goes down, our banks go down, we all go down, Russia goes down as well. Then there's the argument that, okay, Russia's response is reasonable, it's legitimate, it's expected, it's inevitable response to Western policies. And there is a point to this, it can't be denied there is a point to this. When the Cold War ended, there was no appetite in Western capitals, I was there, to renegotiate European security. There was a lot of momentum behind the EU and NATO. These organizations are Cold War organizations, folks. There was a lot of momentum for them to continue. One of the reasons, though, that we didn't really want to change them to bring in Russia was that Russia didn't want to come in. Why is Russia not keen to join these organizations? This is a very important point, I think, which isn't always understood. These organizations, the biggest countries in these organizations, from the United States, Germany, UK, France, or whatever, they accept limits on their own power. In the EU, it's absolutely explicit. The voting weight of Germany compared to its power is much less than the voting weight of Luxembourg compared to its power. Russia is not interested in any organization where Russia's power is symbolically less than Luxembourg's, or less than ours, or less than yours. That's not what they do. They don't think in those terms, and they want to keep their options open, and that's understandable if you stretch from Finland to Vladivostok. Why has the West been expanding NATO and the EU? What about Kosovo? You know, there are questions one can debate about these things. What I think about EU and NATO enlargement is this. The EU and NATO offer the former communist world, and if I can say so, including Hungary, the only chance to get away from the organized form of former Soviet imperialism and the GRU and the KGB. If Poland or Hungary or any of these countries had the GRU and KGB elements working in their foreign offices, working in their prime minister's offices, working in their newspapers, working deep in the army, they would not reform. The transparency and process brought about by NATO and brought about by EU membership allows people to get away from that and to choose their own destiny. You either have mice in your house or you don't. There's no issue about mice. They're either there or they're not. You either have the GRU deep in your army structures or you don't. And it's a legitimate thing not to want mice in the house. It's a legitimate, reasonable thing not to want elements controlled by Moscow, given everything that's happened, to be right in the deepest parts of your state institution. Let me finish off. Does Russia face real problems arising from the end of the Cold War and the USSR? Yes. You have to have sympathy with, I really do have, you know, in a sense, sympathy with Mr. Putin. The issues he grapples with are really difficult. The borders, the complexity of what he has to handle is far beyond anything our leaders have to handle. Does Russia have interests? Yes. Is Russia entitled to protect its interests? Yes. Is Russia entitled to protect its interests by stealing other countries' land, by killing its people? No. We have a word for that which even Marxists understand. It's called imperialism. There is no place for physical imperialism like that in the modern world. Maths, folks, mathematics. Imperialism plus fascist sort of instincts equals disaster. We've been there, we've done that. There are only three possibilities in politics. The center expands to squeeze the extremes, or the extremes expand to squeeze the center, or there's a sort of uneasy dynamic equilibrium between center and extremes. The risk we have now is that Russia is exporting anti-European extremism as a matter of state policy, and that the rules, and the most basic rule of all, the rule that keeps the lights on here, the rule that allows us to fly around the planet, the rule that allows us to exist as people in the modern state, that rule is that borders do not get messed with. And that one rule of all rules is now being challenged directly by Moscow. And this is a very, very serious existential threat, because it's not a military threat, it's the threat of an idea. It's the threat of an idea that no longer rules matter. And that's very important. And for me, if I can just finish on this note, what I really don't like about just the way Russian policy works these days is that on the one hand, you have Mr. Putin, the whole state apparatus, somehow glorifying in a way, or nodding to, or giving homage to Stalinism and the Stalin Soviet period. On the other hand, you know, the Soviet Union was great. We all had such a nice time together. You know, it was sort of fun, folks. You know, it was glorious. And just down the road in Ukraine, they are killing former Soviet citizens to show how glorious the Soviet Union was. This is actually, I think, pretty revolting. And I think Russia can do better than that. The only way this is going to trend is that we are all going to get poorer. We're getting poorer now in this room. You are poorer. We are poorer. Everyone on this panel is poorer because of sanctions and because of the whole drama. I just think, really, I do think there is scope for looking at all these issues, folks. There's scope for looking at European security. There's scope for defining some new rules in economic cooperation and military security. You cannot do that if you start off with the idea that rules don't matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. From now on, each speaker will have 17 minutes, because we have to be completely neutral, I'm afraid. You are not obliged. are permitted to speak up to James, you have the floor.
Professor Martoni, the Hungarian sense of humor clearly is very permissive. Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me see if I can keep time without breaking my watch in the process. There we are. Russia is a threat to European security because it has mounted a frontal assault on the treaties, agreements, and indeed principles that ended the Cold War and defined Europe as we have come to know it. It has torn up the rule book. To be sure, the rules have been transgressed before. They were transgressed by Russia in Moldova and the South Caucasus in the 1990s. They were more dramatically transgressed by NATO in Kosovo in 1999. But let us not forget, and I remember discussing the pros and cons of that issue here in Budapest. What occurred in Kosovo was the response to a real humanitarian catastrophe, to real massacres. It occurred in the context of at least 3 UN censures of Slobodan Milosevic, in the context of an elaborate diplomatic mechanism set up of which Russia was part, diplomacy which wore itself out for a period of months until a large coalition of NATO states decided that all other options were exhausted. I opposed NATO's intervention in Kosovo, but there is no parallel between what occurred there and what is occurring in Ukraine. In May 1997, Russia concluded a state treaty with Ukraine that regulated a whole host of issues that confirmed in final form what had already been confirmed in multilateral treaties and agreements: Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, its borders, and all of the rest of it. And Ukraine, in turn, undertook, as it had before, to observe fundamental principles of human rights, including protection of minorities. In the 17 years between the signature of that treaty and the appearance of green men in Crimea in February last year, Russia did not once, before any international body, raise a single complaint about Ukraine's policy towards Russian minorities. Indeed, in all that period, not once but several times, the OSCE, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, praised Ukraine for its ethnic, linguistic, and religious tolerance. Not a single complaint. We are therefore expected to believe that in the week or two before Yanukovych fell from office, a threat was mounted in eastern Ukraine, of all places, in Crimea, where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is based, against the rights and the lives and the well-being of Russian citizens on a scale to warrant intervention, first by stealth and then overtly. Russia's entire campaign against Ukraine, its war in Ukraine and its justifications for it, have been based from start to finish on lies, occasionally ornamented by non sequiturs and half-truths. The brazenness of what has occurred is absolutely staggering, and it is a challenge to us all. My second point is that if the proposition today were reversed, if the proposition today were that the EU has been a threat to Russia, I will astonish the opposition here and say I would also be in agreement, but with one key nuance. The European system, which is a rules-based and values-based system, is indeed an objective threat to the system of power which has emerged in Russia over the past 15 years. and its system of economic management as well, that mainstream Russian experts, until recently, were able openly to describe as predatory and neo-feudal. I don't think I need to remind a Hungarian audience that the Soviet Union also felt threatened by systems that were more attractive than its own. And perhaps less so than Russia, because then there was an Iron Curtain, and today there is not. Russia, indeed, the leaders of Russia and a large number of other people do have felt an existential threat from NATO and laterally EU enlargement, because they have failed to see what, again, is well understood in Hungary, and I remember these discussions as well, that the fundamental reason for enlarging NATO was not anti-Russian, it was a response to an existential issue of finally allowing the countries of Central Europe to exit a gray zone of security and a gray zone of civilization. The question is, however sincere Russians' perceptions might be about the world outside, the question for everyone else is, what effect does this have on other people, on their own interests, on their own choices, on their own aspirations? For 20 years, Russia has openly and officially, I could cite all the documents, equated its own security with the limited sovereignty of its neighbors. Every single proposal the Russians advance for a new security structure, openly or between the lines, comes at the expense of others. May I remind you that the issue, as pressure was building up against Ukraine in 2013, before the Vilnius summit, was not NATO. It was increasingly brutal pressure applied on President Yanukovych, who instituted a law on non-black bloc status that barred Ukraine from NATO membership. It was all in response to the EU association agreement. And indeed, there is an objective reason for this. When the Balts joined the EU, of course, to Russia, this was very irritating and unpalatable. But if Ukrainians, who are defined now officially, as they have often been in the past, as simply a branch of the Russian people and as part of Russia's distinctive culture and civilization, do so, this clearly has deep repercussions for the internal order in Russia. It suggests to Russians, well, if Ukrainians can do this, why is this, for historical reasons, barred for us? My penultimate point. Chairman, do I have 5 minutes? Yes, okay. My penultimate point, which is implicit in what I have already said, this is not just about Ukraine, it is not even primarily about Ukraine. After the annexation of Crimea, Vladimir Putin articulated a view of the restoration of what he called historic Russia on a basis that is directly in opposition to, and for many repellent to, the current interstate order of Europe, because it is based on ethnicity and language. And that has immediate repercussions for at least 2 of the Baltic states that contain very large minorities of Russian ethnicity. And these are not simply connections that outsiders are at liberty to infer. At the last Valdai Forum, which I attended in October last year, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said openly, Moldova and the Baltic states need to consider events in Ukraine and draw conclusions. Let me conclude. Alas, there is no quick or easy solution available to the challenge we face, which the Kremlin presents openly now in civilizational, that is to say, ideological terms to Europe. Russia will alter its approach only when its power structures in Putin's immediate entourage and outside them conclude that the present course is damaging Russian interests and their own. Success will not make them more reasonable. Failure is the only thing which will bring this about. If we decide that the solution lies in compromising with our own principles, our own standards, and our own interests, we will only prolong the problems we face. The challenge we have is to find effective and intelligent ways of constraining Russia and protecting our own allies and our own partners. And ladies and gentlemen, that is not easy, and it's not necessarily going to become easier. So on that cheerful note, I will end. Thank you.
We do have a dreadful conflict in Europe. Instead of prosperity based on cooperation between Russia and the West, we have a humanitarian disaster. We cannot take seriously the official numbers of victims of about 6,000 people. German intelligence has estimated that about 50,000 people have lost their lives. Infrastructure has been destroyed, and Ukrainian economy is on its knees. Surely, this is absolute disaster. This is a far cry from what we had set out to achieve 2 years ago, or at least a year ago. But things could get much worse if we are not careful, because we are risking nuclear standoff in Europe. Is this really worth it? Equally disturbing, and our speakers have not mentioned this at all, the West is making a common cause with neo-Banderite movements, in other words, neo-Nazi movements. We do not need Russian propaganda to tell us about this. The alleged neo-Nazis are actually proud of it. They are proud of their origins, and they do not want to conceal them. I argue that this is Europe's darkest hour. We always blame Putin, Russia, and Russian people of everything. But the honest truth is that it is us, it is we who are the main guilty party. I'm saying this for the following reasons. Instead of negotiating a security system which would treat Russia as an equal partner, we pushed NATO under its nose and to its borders, claiming that it is none of its business. In 2007, Putin gave us a strong warning in Munich that Russia would not accept this situation. He spoke against the domination by a single hyperpower. We know which hyperpower we are talking about. And he argued that security cannot be divided. In other words, he was saying genuine security in Europe cannot be based on the notion that the security of one partner is more important than another. This surely is illogical, and it is also undemocratic. How did we react to his very reasonable position? We laughed at his so-called alleged aggression, and we did not take him seriously. A year later, in August 2008, we massacred Russian civilians and peacekeepers in South Ossetia. And then we had the nerve to describe this as Russia's invasion of Georgia. If Russia wanted to invade Georgia, they would indeed invade the entire country, and they would control it till today. Events in Ukraine are a repetition of this ridiculous, misconceived policy, only that we have now got much more brazen and dangerous and more arrogant. Now, have we learned anything from history? In 1815, post-Napoleonic France was included in the Congress of Vienna as an equal partner,
and its interests were fully respected. Decades of peace and stability followed under the so-called concept of Europe. In 1919, on the other hand, Germany was excluded at Versailles, and within 2 decades, Europe was again devastated by a much deadlier conflict. Have we really forgotten all this? What is the point of studying history when we so grandly ignore it again and when we rushed into these conflicts again? The British academic Richard Sakwa has put it recently very well in his latest book. NATO now exists to manage the risks created by its own existence. Let's look at the peaceful and constructive path which we could have taken and should have taken. Instead of negotiating an optimal path for Ukraine economic development as a bridge between West and Russia, we pushed Moscow out of the picture, claiming that Ukrainians' membership in NATO was nothing to do with Moscow. It was none of their business. How on earth could this be none of their business? What about the close relations in economy? What about the long-standing cultural and family links between these two peoples? And if this is none of Moscow's business, how come that it is the legitimate business of the United States, of Britain, of Poland, and I would argue even of Baltic republics? What business is it of theirs? Relationship between close brothers such as Ukraine and Russia. We cynically exploited the legitimate grievances against President Yanukovych, I will agree with that, and we turned them into a violent coup d'etat, driven by a melange of very, very murky forces, I already mentioned them, proudly claiming continuity with Ukrainian Nazism. When Donetsk and Lugansk rejected this chauvinistic anti-Russian regime, whose first measure was to ban the use of Russian language in their own countries, they rightly feared discrimination and ethnic cleansing. We saw ethnic cleansing in Yugoslavia. You know, we have a lot to talk about these things. But these people were labeled as terrorists. And then we started, not we, but our beloved regime in Kiev, started indiscriminately bombarding their cities. They killed terrorists, they killed women, children, and old people, maimed them and killed them, and they described them as terrorists. What a ridiculous idea. If you don't believe me, there is plenty of stuff on YouTube. You can find many, many very distressing videos. You will, of course, say it's Russian propaganda. I don't believe it. I don't believe it's Russian propaganda. When the Kremlin stepped in to prevent the slaughter without without sending its regular armed forces, which, in my opinion, they had every right to do, in fact, obligation to do, we immediately described Putin as an aggressor and, of course, a new Hitler. Putin also earned himself this label when he annexed, so-called annexed, but actually reclaimed Crimea. Why he did it? Obviously, he wouldn't want to give the Sevastopol naval base to NATO. That was actually the plan. Our friends here would never admit that. Even President Obama recently made statements to that effect, and I quote him here. Quote him from his recent interview. President Putin made a decision about Crimea and Ukraine not because of some grand strategy, remember that, no grand strategy, but because he was caught off guard with the protests on the Maidan, end of quote. So, who is the aggressor and who is the victim of aggression? I submit that we are the aggressors. And unfortunately, we have not had enough of it. Having lost these last battles, we believe we haven't lost the war. We will continue to arm the Ukrainians and train them. Fortunately, not all is yet lost. We can still climb out of the hole that we have dug out. But first of all, as we know, we must stop digging any deeper. So in the rest of my remarks here, I will suggest what we should do and, in fact, what we must do. Number one, accept that Russia has the right to sovereignty, independence, and protection of its legitimate security interests. In fact, I would argue it is the essence of democracy, genuine democracy, to uphold your sovereignty, sovereignty of your state, not to farm out defense of your state to the United States. We do this all the time. We talk about our security. So why are we denying it to the Russian people who have been invaded several times in history, invaded last time by Hitler? Would Western strategists tolerate Russian bases in former East Germany, Austria, or the Channel Islands, or North Africa? Of course not. Number two, let's behave as genuine democrats that we claim we are, and declare that we respect the will of the Russian people when they support their president. And let's stop demonizing Putin as an autocrat, dictator, or even a terrorist. By doing so, we are insulting the entire Russian nation. Do we really realize what we are doing? An intrinsic and brilliant part of European culture, the nation that has liberated us from Nazism once before, and is going to most likely do it again. Number three, accept that Russia is no longer an imperialist and totalitarian power. These things destroyed its economy, and she doesn't want to return to them. We have no need to lecture them about it. They know it themselves. Number four, apologize for our shameful support of the very unsavory regime that we maintain in Kiev, for the atrocities it has committed and it keeps continuing to commit. Number five, investigate the Maidan sniper killings a year ago. Explain why after accusing Putin of shooting down the Malaysian airliner MH17, we have suddenly stopped investigating it. What exactly is going on there? Why don't we release the information from the airliner black boxes? The British hold them. Why aren't they telling us what's in them? And the conversation between the pilots and the traffic controllers. Why doesn't America assist us by releasing what is known from what it knows from its satellites and aerial reconnaissance? Do we have anything to hide? Number six, demand that our allies in Kiev stop concealing the true scale of victims among its armed forces. This is the least we and the regime should do to honor the sacrifice of these people who have been dragged into an army and serve a cause in which they do not believe. Indeed, why aren't we really supporting Ukraine's economy? We have backed a democratic, so-called democratic regime there, but we have been extremely stingy. $17 billion over 3 years is nothing, and we all know it. And Ukraine, even before all this started, Ukraine already was the poorest country in Europe, actually reaching African levels of per capita consumption as measured in dollars. Number 8, finally, inform the main guilty party in this tragedy, the current regime in Washington, that Europe no longer needs and wants its so-called protection, because the protector has turned into a destroyer of our continent. Incidentally, and I will stress that, also acting against the best interest of its own American citizens. They are misinformed. It is Washington and not Putin who is destroying European democracy. Indeed, why would Putin bother when we are so eagerly doing it ourselves? Let's be honest, NATO has degenerated into an empire where some players are definitely more equal than others. It is an empire of global hegemons and vassals, similar to the Soviet bloc that we all had known. What has this to do with democracy? Here in Central Europe, we have seen it all before, and so we know what we are talking about. Europe is being humiliated. like never in history. You remember what Miss Newland told us about what they think about us. Did she have to apologize? No, not at all. She didn't bother, and she didn't have to resign. Is this democracy? Freelancing busybodies like Senator McCain keeps riding around Europe and advising our governments, telling our governments not to pursue the South Stream. He can even overrule the European Commission on this very, very vital strategic issue. So, will Mr. McCain, will he supply us with energy when we need it, with Russian gas? No, he won't. Will he pay for it? Of course not. So, last 3 points. Genuine allies are obliged to correct the conduct of their leader. They must not just wait and obey him out of sense of misguided unity. America is on a disastrous course. It is destroying Europe, and it is destroying itself. It is destroying her own values. I believe that Washington is actually acting against its best interest without being aware of it. So it is our duty as responsible allies to inform it of the errors of its ways. And finally, the only leader deserving to be called real leader is actually Mr. Orban. We need more people like him. We need leaders with real spine, not another imperial nomenclatura, this time based in Brussels instead of Moscow around our own capitals. Thank you very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, do Putin's policies pose a threat to wider European security? Will he escalate the conflict in Ukraine? The short answer is no. Russia has a specific problem with Ukraine, namely its potential integration into NATO, which Putin is trying to address in a limited and characteristically Russian way. To understand Russia's actions, we need to understand one thing above all, that Eastern Europe is flat. Take a look at the map. North of the Carpathians, there are no natural barriers, such as mountains or wide rivers that might impede a military attack on Russia from the west. Just endless flatland forming the northern European plain. This is Russia's Achilles heel. 3 times in the last 2 centuries, Russia has been invaded from the west across this plain, first by Napoleon, then by Imperial Germany, and finally by Nazi Germany. And on each occasion, Russia was devastated. Now, Russia's long-standing solution to its lack of natural defenses is depth. In order to protect the heartland, Russia has always tried to maintain a ring of friendly buffer states on its western frontier, which can delay the advance of a marauding army. Now, these buffers today are Belarus and Ukraine. Belarus is loyal to Russia, but since last year, Ukraine has decided to integrate with the West, that is, with the EU and with NATO, and this leaves Russia deeply exposed. Unless Russia acts now, NATO will be free to establish bases in eastern Ukraine, meaning that at any time, NATO can roll its tanks northwards across miles of flatland towards Moscow, annexing territory at will. Alternatively, NATO will be free to drive an army eastwards towards Kazakhstan, whose border is only 500 kilometers from Ukraine, severing southern Russia from the rest of the state. The rebellious Caucasian republics can then declare their independence, triggering the disintegration of the Russian Federation. Now, this may sound overly alarmist, but it's exactly the strategy which Germany employed in 1941, and Russia is simply unconvinced by NATO's assurances that it means Russia no ill. We may not understand it, but NATO looks very intimidating to Moscow. The organization was created in opposition to Russia and has never abandoned its hostility, even if this was unstated in the last 2 decades. First, NATO encroached on Russia's former sphere in Eastern Europe in defiance of earlier assurances. And now it has revealed its true character. The delight with which some in the West have observed Russia's economic decline in recent months proves what Russia has always suspected, that the West does not wish it well. Put simply, Russia's goal is to protect, Putin's goal is to protect the Russian state from potential attack from the West. He is not interested in rebuilding the Soviet Empire or in redrawing the map of Europe. Yes, Russia took Crimea to prevent its naval base from falling into NATO's hands. But Putin's purview begins and ends in Ukraine, where he is trying to solve a specific problem in the way he must, a limited and defensive military reaction to ensure that Ukraine does not allow NATO onto its territory. Perhaps some of you remain unconvinced. After all, I hear you say, there are many intelligent politicians, analysts, commentators in the West who argue that Russia is on the rampage in Eastern Europe. They are telling us that Russia wants to squash democracy on Russia's borders to prevent the emergence of a liberal society in Russia. That Putin needs to boost his own popularity by feeding the beast of Russian nationalism. That Russia needs its neighbors' resources, be it food, industrial goods, or access to the sea. And they will supply you with the evidence to prove the point, the belligerent rhetoric coming from the Kremlin, Russia's military maneuvers around the Baltic, and of course, its invasion of eastern Ukraine. But to these people, I make 3 points. The first is that Putin does not care about democracy in Ukraine or anywhere else for the simple reason that very few Russians care about such things. Russians tried democracy in the 1990s and they didn't like it. Russians do like strong leadership, and Putin is a strong leader. With an 85% popularity rating, he can afford to indulge Eastern Europe its democracy. The second point is that Russia has no need to grab the resources of its neighbors. Russia is a modern state that trades on the global economy, and it can sell its oil and buy whatever it needs, whether it's Ukrainian corn or German cars. And as for access to the sea, what extra benefit are Tallinn or Riga when Russia has Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg? But third, and most importantly, Russia will not embark on a course of action that provokes a conflict with the West which ends in just one way: massive defeat for Russia, the end of Putin's tenure in power, and the probable breakup of the Russian Federation. Putin is many things, but he is a realist. He knows that Russia has dire economic problems and a shambolic military. There is no way that he will start a conflict in Eastern Europe that pits Russia against the combined might of the United States, the European Union, Canada, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, plus anyone else that the West drafts in. This would be political suicide for Putin and national suicide for Russia. And since his ultimate goal is to retain his throne, Putin is studiously avoiding such a perilous course of action. Indeed, if there is one thing that is strikingly clear from all Russia's activities in Ukraine, it is Russia's extreme caution to the point of concealing its very intervention in the country. Russia neither wants nor can afford a wider confrontation with the West. And there's one further piece of evidence against Russia's supposed imperial ambitions, which is in fact the total absence of any evidence. If there were really some master plan to take over Eastern Europe, there really should be some sign of it. But Putin has made no attempt to prepare public opinion in Russia for a conquest of the region. There's no military build-up in the Baltic. There's no attempt to create a case for war with any of Russia's neighbors. In fact, when it comes to the wider destabilization of Europe, there's no evidence of any planning at all. This begs the question, why are some in the West making these claims? Well, there are several reasons, none of which have to do with Russian imperial expansion, and all of which have to do with the cognitive biases that exist in Europe and America. One is the profound Russophobia in Western foreign policy circles. Cold War veterans have always believed that Russians are the baddies, and a new generation has learned to despise Russia for its repudiation of Western values, especially its treatment of homosexuals. They have convinced themselves that Russia is evil, and now they assume the worst. A second reason is the deep inability in the West to understand the theatrics of Russian political culture with its macho rhetoric, its displays of bravado, and its military posturing. But what Western observers fail to understand is that all of this is for show and implies nothing about Russia's real intentions. But most important of all, like Russia, the West is blinkered by the most traumatic experience in its modern history, namely the Second World War. In the 1930s, Germany emerged from a period of economic chaos, led by a strong leader who held the Olympic Games, then annexed various German-speaking regions before invading Eastern Europe. In this century, Russia emerged from a period of economic chaos, led by a strong leader who held the Olympic Games and then annexed the Russian-speaking region of Crimea. Ergo, Putin is Hitler and is poised to invade Eastern Europe. In conclusion, I put it to you that the West is suffering from a collective mania, reading a master plan for imperial expansion into a single political event, Russia's targeted intervention in eastern Ukraine. Moscow's actions have been hopelessly misconstrued by a community of nervous, excitable, and Russophobic commentators who understand neither Russia nor its motives. Russia has a specific and limited security problem which exists entirely within Ukraine's borders. And President Putin has shown no inclination to embark on a strategically nonsensical imperial conquest of Eastern Europe that would result in his own overthrow and the devastation of his state. On the contrary, all the signs are that this is the very thing he is trying to avoid. So the notion that Russia is somehow on the rampage across the region is absurd. But don't just take my word for it. If there's one country which knows Russia well and has a great deal to fear, it's Latvia. And of all the people living in Latvia, the Minister of Defense is the one whose antenna is most highly attuned to any threat from the Russian bear. But when asked last month whether Russia might try to destabilize the Baltic region, the minister expressed surprise and described the risk as, I quote, very low. I defer to his superior judgment, and I urge you to do the same.
There were so many questions requesting answers. We would agree that each speaker now has 5 minutes to respond and to cover all or almost all the questions, hopefully, that has been put. So if you agree, of course you agree, what could you do? We would follow the same order. So, Charles. Bad luck. Bad luck to me.
Right, thank you to the panel, and actually thank you to you for the range of questions. Very dynamic and frankly difficult range of questions, because these things are big and they're difficult. The theme I find the most interesting, I've been a diplomat, I was a diplomat for nearly 30 years, a lot of it in this part of the world, is psychology. What is it people really want? And you look at an issue over 2 years, but then you look at it over 30 years, and some of you here have been around longer than me. You look at history over 60 years, and you start to see different sorts of patterns. My main career has been in Yugoslavia. I spent 8 years there in Serbia and Sarajevo and blah, blah, blah. Look at the psychology of the breakup of Yugoslavia. 6 actually, but 6.5 if you include Vojvodina, 6.5 of the former republics and autonomous provinces have voted to leave Serbia. There's Serbia, thank you very much, we don't want that. When the Soviet Union broke up, 14 other republics, we all agreed, including Russia actually, to accept the independence of these countries, voted to define themselves by not being with Russia in quite the same way. And this creates real problems for Serbia and for Russia. The others are all winning something. They're getting independence, they're getting a space, they're getting identity. I was in Kazakhstan last week. The sense of identity there, for the first time sort of ever, they feel they can really build something on their own. The loss of the Soviet Union is a massive psychological gain for them. But for Russia and Serbia, they're lost. They're sort of saying, but hang on guys, we really love you, stay with us. And the others are saying, well, yeah, we really love you, but we'd like to be at a bit of a distance, frankly. You know, to be honest, we're quite happy being separate. This creates a very specific dynamic. I completely disagree with the idea expressed by my former Foreign Office colleague here about extreme Russophobia. I mean, who are these people? I've never met them. I've lived in Russia. I've written articles complaining about the Russian policy, but I'm not a Russophobe. It's absurd. I don't understand the argument that Putin is worried about NATO tanks sweeping to the Urals, when he can see that that NATO tanks, NATO aircraft, NATO this, NATO that, are declining in absolute numbers. The threat from NATO is, if it ever was a threat, is massively less now than it was 20 years ago. So the argument that he has to insure against this by killing Ukrainians is absurd. I completely agree with the proposition expressed by one of two of you. We need to think about the attitude of Ukrainians. You know, where do they fit into all this? And that goes back to the point someone made about spheres of influence. Have we gone too far by, you know, trying to bring Ukrainians into our so-called sphere of influence? Did we go too far in welcoming Hungary into our so-called sphere of influence? The answer is, you people wanted to have your own rights. Ukraine wants to have its own rights. The people in Maidan wanted to have their own rights the way that people in Moscow in 1991 did not want the former situation to continue. So when you look at what is a sphere of influence, you have to start off by saying, well, actually, who's in it and who wants to be in it and who doesn't want to be in it? I really do agree, actually, with the idea, a big picture idea, I think you made, Sir, that, you know, are we seeing the end of the Westphalian system? I think that's a very big question, and I've written plenty about that thought, because I think, in some ways, these things are under threat, and, you know, if you look at what will happen next, is it possible that we're moving back to a world that looks more like the 14th century, with very strong units in some places, and very weak, messy, no man's lands in the middle? I mean, I don't think we have to assume the Westphalian system continues indefinitely. And the reasons why, you look in the Middle East, you can see state borders collapsing under our noses. Is it possible that will happen in Europe? Yes, it seems to me that it might. What will satisfy Mr. Putin? This is the key question. You know, is it true that he's just going to stop because he's got enough? He's a very rational figure. I don't know. What's really worrying is that he might not know, and that therefore we can't be sure how to respond. You know, there's always a sense of improvisation in all these things. We can't be sure exactly what goes on when he has his meetings with his GRU guys and with the generals. You know, he's been in power a long time. You get very isolated when you've been in power. You start to lose touch with reality. So I think why are we having this discussion? Because and going back to, who is it? You, sir, said, it wasn't the greatest catastrophe, it's the greatest geostrategic catastrophe. Fine. The greatest geostrategic catastrophe of the 20th century ended up with millions of Ukrainians starving to death. This is not acceptable, and it's absolutely understandable that the sons and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those people do not want more of that. And I just feel really sad, actually. And I have a certain sort of weird sympathy with Russia on this level. They can't put their heads around the fact that that's an issue for some people, that people just don't want that, and that they want to move away from that. And I think, to answer the Russian lady's question, why are we teaching Ukrainians how to fire Russian weapons? I don't even know if we are. But I feel that if there are people who want to be free from that, the idea that them starving to death in Europe, cannibalism in Europe, a few hundred miles away from here, that is okay and was glorious, and that the end of that was a geostrategic tragedy, I think we ought to help them. I think they're entitled to some sort of support. So there we are. Vote for the motion. Thank you.
If I were the world's champion in concision and answered only the most important and captivating questions and points that have been raised in this discussion, I would be here for no less than 25 minutes, so forgive me for being highly selective in 5 This entire discussion reinforces a very important point, which is the one truly impartial point I hope I am making, that those of us who are conducting these arguments have fundamentally different views of reality, of the reality we are discussing. I have made at least 120 visits to Ukraine in the past 20 years. The only part of Ukraine where I don't have close friends and working colleagues is Western Ukraine. In Eastern Ukraine, I have Southern Ukraine and in Kiev. I absolutely do not recognize the country that some of our speakers and some of the audience have been speaking about. What percentage of the vote did right-wing parties get in Ukrainian presidential election and parliamentary elections? Less than 2. Less than they have received in Hungary, less than they get in Britain, far less than they receive in France. How many, and certainly Russia, no fewer than 5 senior Ukrainian politicians, beginning with Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, have Jewish antecedents. What kind of fascist state is that? The new government, before the bill was vetoed by acting President Turchinov, did not ban the use of the Russian language. That would be absolutely impossible in a parliament, the vast majority of whom speak Russian. What they did is they returned to the provisions of the 1996 Constitution, which for 14 years assigned the Ukrainian as a status of state language, and went on to say that the state will guarantee the free development of all other of the Russian language and other languages used inside Ukraine. I have spent most of my time in Ukraine speaking Russian to people who have spoken Russian. A majority of the fighters in the volunteer battalions, the ones who are routinely called fascist, are Russian speakers. I don't recognize the country being discussed. If Ukrainians shot down MH17, who would have the greatest interest in producing the truth? Russia. Why was it necessary for the Russians to produce 3 completely contradictory versions of what happened? One of which I saw completely torn to shreds by an independent Russian expert on Ruski Business Kanal in Moscow. My final point, if I may, not about Ukraine. It is about NATO, as I think some of you have said. NATO enlargement was not a project of NATO members. It was a project of countries that wanted to join NATO, and the first response of NATO has been either no, wait, or in the end, these are the criteria you must meet. The same has been true of the EU. NATO and the EU have enlarged reluctantly and on the basis of consensus. This has been a slow prospect. Eurasian Union enlargement. What did President Putin say to the Armenian president when he was on the verge of signing an association agreement with the EU in Vilnius? He held up a sheet of paper and said, this is the arms contract I propose to sign with Azerbaijan. Now, shall I sign this contract, or do you want to sign this piece of paper joining the Eurasian Customs Union? What did he do with Viktor Yanukovych? Exactly the same thing. In great detail, these are all the sectors of the Ukrainian economy I will proceed to destroy if you go ahead and do this. The rules of the customs union simply entitle Russia to raise the common external tariff from 5% to 11%. Is that what he proposed? No. He basically said to him, if you do this, I will break your legs. And this man, who is as tough and as brutal as they come, Viktor Yanukovych, left that room shaking. So we are talking about a very different Europe here. And just one other point, just to elaborate on what Charles had said about NATO. When NATO enlarged to Central Europe, all the countries of Central Europe, including Hungary, were urged to devote scarce resources to reprofiling their armed forces away from territorial defense, away from continental defense, in order to provide bits and pieces, what's called toolkits in a toolbox, for NATO's expeditionary operations in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And the result is today there is very limited capability of new NATO members to conduct any form of territorial defense. Britain in 2010 shut our 2 air bases in Scotland that protected our northern waters from a Russian reconnaissance presence, which even then was increasing and becoming more aggressive. What kind of threat is this? Does this represent? I've probably exceeded my time. I apologize to those of you. I would be very happy to talk. There were questions about what is likely to happen in Ukraine. Perhaps we could talk about that in the margins. I'd be very happy to. Thank you very much.
The issue of Putin making the statement about restoration of the Soviet Union, it is well known to people who actually study and who look into it that he actually never said that. He was widely misquoted. He said one of the biggest tragedies of the 20th century. And he was talking about the people who were misplaced, who were left in the former Soviet republics, who lost all their savings. He was talking about human tragedies of that kind. He in no way was implying that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst tragedy than Nazi regime and Nazi domination in Europe, and of course Nazi attack on the Soviet Union. If anybody is interested, I will send you precise translations, precise quote of Putin actually said, and linguistic analysis. All this has been willfully misrepresented to paint Putin as a new Hitler. So that's one thing. Regarding the shot down airliner, the gentleman who raised the issue, I want forensic evidence. I'm a scientist. I don't want Mr. Obama coming 3 hours later and saying it was Putin and everybody parroting him.
Why didn't they let the experts there?
We do not know whether we have no precise information who was allowed to the site or not. My issue is who has the black boxes? Who has the recordings of the pilots with the control? The most important evidence has not been released and will not be released because Ukrainian, excuse me, it is my time to talk. Excuse me. It is the duty of the investigators to go through all this evidence, and hopefully by June or July we should learn the details. But I bet you something, we will never know. We will never be told the truth. And the scandal is that British people, Dutch people, and of course many other nationalities were involved. People who belong to our alliance. I simply do not understand it. So let's leave that one. Why is Ukraine not part of Europe? You know, question from the BBC. Well, isn't Russia part of Europe? What's wrong? Why can't we integrate entire Europe? Haven't you read Dostoevsky? Don't you listen to Russian music? What's wrong with us that we keep excluding this great nation, this great culture, treating them as if they don't belong to Europe? In my opinion, they do belong to Europe. If Ukraine will survive, what should Hungary do or will not survive? I think Hungarian Prime Minister knows what to do himself, and I personally would advise him to accept whatever result comes out of it. Simply accept it. It's a Hungarian problem. 300 US instructors coming in now in Ukraine. My answer is the United States want to continue this conflict because the Minsk II looks like being too peaceful, probably leading to some kind of settlement, so we have to restart the war. Washington will never accept peace because it's not in, they believe, mistakenly, it's not in their interest. Why are Russians flying bombers around Britain? Why is NATO messing around in Russia's border? They're just doing the same what the West believes has the right to do. Would Putin be satisfied with federal Ukraine? Of course he would. If Putin was in Ukraine, he would have invaded, as he said. We could have invaded, taken over Ukraine in 2 weeks. Of course they could have done, but who would want to do it? A failed state, bankrupt state, if they have economic problems. Why on earth would they want to do it? What do Ukrainians in the East actually want? I think they would settle for substantial, significant autonomy, to have self-rule, but they actually did not want to lead to disintegration of the Ukrainian state. They didn't want to, and it may actually not. It depends on Kiev how it behaves. Question about the BBC. That is somebody, one of our Hungarian friends said, BBC has discovered a plan about Putin. Of course, the Russian Security Council has plans for every conceivable contingency. And of course, it's their job to have a plan about the Crimea. But I will tell you something. I no longer believe the BBC anything. Nothing. It's all manufactured. I will give you the last, and I'm finishing now, last example, the Nemtsov assassination immediately, innuendo that Putin did it, a long list of people who were allegedly shot on Putin's orders. One of them was, they were all described as Putin's opponents. One of them was Paul Klebnikov, who actually was a Putin supporter. And violent death of Boris Berezovsky. Well, Boris Berezovsky committed suicide. And so, to me, BBC is supposed to be the model for everyone, for the whole world. And they manipulate information constantly when it comes to these kind of issues. I think it's a criminal offense if you push me hard. Because British people, and of course the global public, deserve better. Thank you very much.
Try to tie them up in a single idea, which I'll put to you now. And it will begin with the question which somebody asked just down here, which is about whether this is a local conflict or whether it has continental proportions. And I do stand by my original thesis, which I set out a few minutes ago, which is that Russia has no strategic interest in escalating this conflict. And for that matter, neither does the West. But I am very fearful that this conflict will escalate, even though neither side wants it to happen. And just to pick up on the question that came from over here, this is not a moral judgment on my part. I don't have any particular sympathy for Putin, at least no more or no less than I would for any Western leader. What I see here is the key concept I see here is something that international relations theorists call the security dilemma. Each side takes actions which are intended to be defensive, but are perceived by the other side as aggressive, leading to a defensive response which is then perceived by the first side as aggressive. And this is how conflicts escalate. And I think we are right now on the cusp of a very serious escalation in the Ukrainian conflict. And the question of the moment is whether the West should assist the Ukrainian military in some way. It's taking baby steps towards this, offering technical advisors, perhaps non-lethal weaponry, but it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to see that the next logical step in this process would be actually sending Western troops to buttress the Ukrainian forces. Now, in some ways, with greatest respect to Charles, I think the key issue here is that we in the West, as Charles put it eloquently, he cannot understand why NATO poses a threat to Russia. And that is indeed the very problem. It's not for us to judge why Russia perceives NATO as a threat. The point is, Russia does. And that is the idea that we need to keep at the forefront of our minds when considering what we do next in this conflict. There is a very serious chance now that, because we are starting to assist the Ukrainian army, that Russia is going to respond in kind. And there are many things that Russia can do. It doesn't necessarily involve using its army. It can attempt political subversion in states such as Hungary or Greece, Cyprus. It can launch a cyber attack on states in the West. In extremis, it can even suspend energy supplies if it wants to. Now, somebody asked the question, what should Hungary do next? And my answer to that is that Hungary should use all of its power to help de-escalate this conflict before it really does become the regional conflict, which I was arguing in my presentation that Putin doesn't want, or the West for that matter. There will have to be some kind of compromise over Ukraine. It can be more democratic. It can integrate more closely with the West. It can have a kind of special relationship with the West, but it can't join NATO, and it probably can't join the EU unless we are willing to start a very serious war with Russia in order to achieve that goal. And to my mind, that is not a price worth paying. And I say that with heavy heart because I know there are many Ukrainians who would like exactly that kind of relationship, but we have to be cognizant of the geopolitics involved here. You cannot wish Russia away, and you cannot disregard its point of view on this matter, however ridiculous you may think it is, however much you may think that NATO poses no threat to Russia. Russia holds that view, and that is our reality. And I think I will finish my comments right there. So thank you, everyone.
I just would like to thank all of you, primarily to the speakers, for their contribution, also for all the good questions that have been asked, and just a very minor comment. Of course, I respect the rule, and this is not about Ukraine, but I would like to thank you for your very favorable statistics regarding Hungarian car crashes. In a more general sense, the favorable statistics about manslaughter, which is true, but there is a reason for that, and this is very simple. We Hungarians, in most cases, we try to kill each other by words and not by action. And I think this time we had a very good battle of words, this time among non-Hungarians. But that was very useful, and I think that we will keep it in our memory, all of us, and we are very grateful to all of you. Now, my last question, and this is the conclusion itself. I'll make no comments upon the results, whatever they might turn out to be. So, just a sense of the meeting. Who is supporting the motion? First. Oh, okay, I read out, because I thought that you all learned it, but do Putin's policies threaten European stability? That view was represented by persons on my right-hand side, and opposing the motion were the speakers on my left-hand side. So now again, who supports the motion? This time it's much more interesting, so you always have to ask a clear question. And who is against it? Against the motion. Okay, so we now have a rough idea. This is, of course, a reflection of the persons in this room. But I think that we all learned a lot, and I'm personally grateful for all the arguments and information which we all received. Thank you very much. Good night, and see you next time. I also would like to express my thanks to the Danube Institute, to Gerald Frost. I think it was an excellent idea. Maybe it's a little bit of a novelty for us Hungarians, but this is a good beginning. And I think we can, I mean, not we, but you can, do a similar exercise on different other subjects, maybe less emotionally laden subjects. But in any case, I think our political culture can be improved and developed by such experiences. And this is an additional reason why we are grateful to the Danube Institute. Thank you again. Good evening and good night to everyone.